my presentation can't substitute the reading of the paper, of course, because it's not a lecture in the pure sense, but it's a kind of outlining the major ideas, the key ideas of the paper. And the title of the study and the somehow modified title of my presentation is Engaging the Business Sector in Vocational Education and Training, and the subtitle From Intentions to Strategy Development. The subtitle is quite important because it paves the way of the paper in terms of what can you expect from the paper. We feel that, engaging the business in vocational education is self-evident, self-explanatory. It's like, you can't play football without a ball. So you can't introduce dual vocational education without having the engagement of the companies. That's quite self-explanatory, but from intentions to strategy development, maybe something on top of it, because there are all good intentions around, but just transforming the intentions into a strategy, into an implementation strategy, is not that common. And the intention of the paper, or the purpose of the paper, would be to support all those who have the intention to go from a good objective to an implementation strategy. So I would like to structure my presentation into 4 parts. First of all, I would like to make some brief words on why to engage the business sector, because dual education as such and engaging the business sector is not an objective or an aim in itself. It's a method, it's a measurement in order to achieve different objectives, and it's always important to know what are the objectives behind. Secondly, I would like to address the challenges, what difficulties may arise when trying to engage the business sector. Then I would come to the know-how, to the instruments, what are the areas of engagement, how can the business sector take action. And ultimately, I would like to at least outline a roadmap from the idea to the implementation. So why to engage the business sector? And there may be many different perspectives on this question. One would be, and that's in the middle part of the slide, there may be educational reasons. One key reason could be to increase the relevance of vocational education. As you certainly know, in vocational education systems which are school-based, very often the companies complain about the lack of relevance of vocational education. And there's kind of paradox going on. On one hand, they complain about the lack of relevance. On the other hand, they are reluctant to get engaged. So this is a kind of tension in the system, and one has to be aware of this tension. This could well have a lot to do with the culture and the tradition in the respective country, where you have the underlying culture that the state is responsible for all educational affairs, including vocational education. And nobody starts with the idea that anybody else apart from the state is in charge of providing any kind of education. And that it's just one explanation of this paradox. Second reason could be to improve the quality. As we all know, school-based education is highly theoretically oriented, and if you combine theory and practice, this could well, at least in the vocational education area, this could well increase the relevance and also the quality of the provision. It could increase the attractiveness if at least key companies are involved, and this could attract school leavers and their parents, and this could also contribute to a higher status of vocational education in the country. And from the perspective of the addressees, learning could lead to earning. It could mean that having passed vocational education, this could be a good basis for earning their own living. Second cluster would be economic reasons, the upper part, and it's kind of mirroring the educational reasons, because for companies, vocational education could be a major provider of qualified staff, and it could, as a consequence, increase the productivity, and for foreign companies in particular, it could remove investment barriers, because companies only invest in foreign countries if they have the qualified labor they need there. And last but not least, there are societal reasons: inclusion, social integration, reducing youth unemployment, many other reasons which are on the agenda of a government apart from economic issues. So these are different reasons, and if you go into the countries, the priorities for this reason may be quite different, but more or less they all are to some extent relevant in the countries. What difficulties may arise? If we talk about apprenticeships, if we talk about dual education, one has to be aware that it's not a remedy, it's not a measurement, it's not a system for all parts of the economy. Because there are, at least in many developing countries, there are areas in the economic sectors where you don't need qualified staff. You get along with unskilled and semi-skilled labor. And it doesn't make much sense to push companies in these areas to enter the dual education field or the apprenticeship field. So you have, it's a major starting point. You have to focus on those economic sectors where you really need qualified staff, because there it's quite evident for the companies that they have to do something in this area. As already mentioned earlier, vocational education is regarded, in many countries, regarded as a state responsibility, and there's no long tradition of public-private partnerships. No social partnerships, which is a kind of the constitution of the DNA in Switzerland, in Germany, many Western European countries, but which is not very common in other countries, in other parts of the world. As we all know, status of vocational education is often very low, and it's not that has two implications. It's very low from the perspective of school leavers. So it's not highly attractive for them to enter vocational education. They all strive for entering a university. And entering a university might lead to failures, but it's more or less an ambition for all parents and all school leavers. But that means that if not all of them manage to go to university, and that's the case in all countries, there are those who are left behind. There are those who don't get university place, who are not entitled to study, and they are regarded as losers, as failures, as low performers, as low achievers, and that keeps the status of vocational education where these people end up very low. On the other hand, and that's the second perspective, the companies who have to recruit people for apprenticeships, for example, or for internships, for any kind of vocational education, they are left with those who don't manage to get to the university. So they have to deal with those who are, at least in terms of school performance, on the low side of the scale. And fourthly, one has to say that dual vocational education is comparatively complex and longsome. In Switzerland, for example, on average, an apprenticeship takes about 3 years. And if you take the recruitment processes, which is prior to this 3 years, and add it, you have a period of 4 years, which is quite a long time, and it's not quite, it's not, the companies are not on the safe side to be sure that after these 4 years, graduates of the vocational education enter or continue in employment. So it's quite a risky issue there. And if you have the alternative to recruit people from different areas of the education system, let's say university graduates, and have had some trainee programs on it, the period is much shorter, and it's accompanied with much lower risk here. So from that perspective, it's not quite easy to convince companies to enter this field, at least if you have the yardstick of an apprenticeship in the Swiss or in the German mode. One has also say a few words on the terminology here. One could have a long discussion on different terms here. For example, apprenticeship has different notions in different countries. The Swiss notion of apprenticeship is that you have, on average, a 3-year education period, partly in a company and partly in a vocational school. In other countries, it's more or less an internship of a few months. So you have many different terms for the same issue, or you have different terms. You have different terms for the same issue, and you have the same terms for different issues. So it's necessary to clarify some issues here, some terms. If we talk about the business sector, we have to be aware that it's not the whole economy which is meant here. You have to focus on those economic sectors which need qualified staff. If you try to get companies or the business sector engaged, start with those sectors which are more suitable than others. And secondly, if you talk about the business sector, you have not only to address the formal sector, the formal economy, but also the informal economy. In many countries, for example, in many African countries, but also in countries such as Afghanistan, for example, you have a strong informal economy accompanied by a large informal apprenticeship system, which means that young people enter small companies as a rule, and they are trained along the needs of this specific company. They don't join any kind of vocational school, but they have some kind of training, which is very much customized to the needs of a specific company. But that's a kind of system which works in many countries. And that means that if you take that for granted, you can build on that, and you don't need to add a different system completely with completely different rules. And a third thought encompasses the fact that if you talk about the business sector, you don't just address companies, but you also address what usually is called business membership organizations, or which means that there are some kind of intermediary organizations, which can be chambers in some countries, which can be employers associations in other countries, which can also be guilds, craft organizations in some countries. So these membership organizations can play a very important role in the countries when it comes to the systematic engagement of the business sector. And another issue is, if you talk about the dual system, it can mean two different things. It can mean a very complex system encompassing governance in a very complex way, with chambers, with state regulations, with many, many organizations involved in this whole system, plus teaching and learning system, the didactic or the curricular part of it, which makes up the Central European VET systems. That's a very complex system, and it's almost impossible to transfer these very complex systems into other countries. So that's why I like to talk more about what I call a dualized vocational education and training system, which means it's a system which can be organized in many different ways, but which has a very core structure, core element, which is that practical and theoretical elements of teaching and learning are combined. And that's the major part. So the learning happens along the lines of combining practical skills and theoretical knowledge. And when it comes to the transfer and when it comes to the establishment of new systems, VET systems in many countries, I think it's more realistic to talk about dualized VET rather than dual system. The guiding question of the study and the accompanied implementation tool would be, given the frame conditions of a country, which every country is quite different, the question is, how can the business sector in suitable economic sectors, not in the whole economy, be engaged to contribute to the further advancement of dualized VET? That's the starting point, that's the focal point of the study, and the underlying transfer assumption is that you can't copy one system, like let's say the Swiss system, and copy that for other countries, but you can embed principles, you can embed elements of good practices of one system and try to adjust it into other countries. Now I come to the very core of the study and the implementation tool. I try to cluster different areas of engagement. It means that when you think of getting companies engaged in the vocational education and training area, it may be in quite different ways in different sectors. And it may happen from different points of views or different kind of frame conditions. And I started by thinking of what are the ideal types of VET systems. And from literature, you get quite a clear picture. You have basically three types of vocational education and training systems. People call it name it in different terminology, but it's basically a school-based VET system, which means vocational education and training happens in a formal sense in vocational schools. On the opposite, it's a market-oriented system. It's a learning-on-the-job system, where it's kind of learning on the job. It's done in the company. It's very narrowly defined according to the needs of a specific company. That's the other extreme. It's the other ideal type. And in the middle, you have the dual VET system, also an ideal type, never existing as such in one country. The dual system, which, as I said already, it has a very complex governance structure, and it has a kind of mix between practical skills and theoretical knowledge. In almost all countries, you have a mix of these different systems, even in Switzerland. In Switzerland, especially in the Italian and the French part of Switzerland, you have a quite an elaborated school-based VET system. And you have some dual VET elements. In the German part of Switzerland, it's the other way around. You have a very strong dual VET system and some school-based VET system. In other countries, it's very much the same. You have a formal, for example, Afghanistan. I am quite familiar with this country because I worked on that quite a lot. You have hardly any dual vet system, very few, some 3,000 or 4,000 school leavers enter a dual vet system. Then you have some 3-4% of school leavers entering a school-based vet system, but you have some 50% of school leavers entering an informal apprenticeship system, learning on the job system. So, and the idea would be, if you try to think on how to engage companies in these countries, you have to be aware in specific sectors, what is the starting point? Is the starting point in a sector a school-based vet system? Is the starting point a learning on the job system? Where to start from? And as I said, it can be in one sector a school-based vet system, and in another sector, in the craft sector, for example, it can be the learning on the job system. And then you have I distinguished many different areas of engagement. I clustered 7. You can subcluster it if you like to more detail, but I think this covers the major areas here. There are 4 areas which are positioned on the training level and 3 on the institutional or the organizational level. I think many of them, they speak for itself, so I don't need to explain it at length here. Implementation of company-based training phases, which does not necessarily mean that it's ruled by curricular regulations, that it has a clear curriculum, that's high-level implementation. On a low-level implementation, it can start with internships or traineeship elements. But it means that as a first step, it can mean that companies get involved into delivery of specific training phases. Secondly, companies can get engaged in the conduct, in the preparation, conduct, and evaluation of examinations, and as such also contribute to issuing certifications or certificates. Thirdly, they can get involved in the qualification of their own training staff, but also get involved in the qualification of the vocational school teaching staff. Also, they can get involved in the provision of equipment, technological, digital equipment, for example, and in the provision of teaching materials. Then on the more institutional, organizational level, they can get involved in the governance on the national, on the regional, on the local level. For example, on the local level, they can become member of a school board. On the national level, they can become member in commissions trying to improve the national vocational education and training area. If a new law, for example, is in preparation, they can get involved in this endeavor. Also, and that's a major issue, they can cooperate in the curriculum development to make curricula more relevant. And of course, they can also get involved in the financing of the system to some extent. It's a tricky issue, I know, but I think it should be mentioned here as well. If you start from the learning on the job side, the endeavor should be to complement the practical phases of the training with theoretical phases. So to convince companies to allow periods of leave for their apprentices, that would be an approach here. Also, they could get involved as a corporation side in the development and implementation of training standards. So not just do anything, but do something which is anything which is very sensible and which is following specific standards. And also they can get involved in the development and implementation of exams and certifications. So these are areas of engagement, and it doesn't mean that every company has to get engaged in every area, but that's kind of options to take. And it has, as part of the implementation strategies, it has to figure out which economic sector starts where, and which economic sectors has good fertile grounds for getting involved in which areas of engagement. So, and that goes to having set all the, or having laid out all the options. The question would be now how to proceed when getting to an implementation strategy. So, and the way from the options to the implementation strategy can be structured by three different questions. First of all, what is already there, where to start from, what are good practices, what are open-minded companies which can be approached easily. So that would be the identification of the starting points. Then secondly, prioritization, which raises the question of what is possible, what areas of engagements are feasible, which are possible, which should be followed up. And thirdly, how to proceed, how to approach companies, what are relevant communication processes to pursue, and what are relevant arguments to follow here. That leads to the roadmap, which is elaborated in the study at some more detail, but which basically follows this procedure here. First of all, it's necessary to put the objective into concrete terms. For example, to say how many companies should in sector X be approached to engage in which kind of areas of engagement. That's the clear operationalized objective, which should be formalized somehow. Secondly, it should be a clear prioritization of the relevant economic sectors. So, as I said, not every sector is suitable. And first of all, of course, there has to be a need for qualified labor. Sectors which are higher stability, which are kind of mature and very, very promising in terms of stability, should be approached first. Whereas some potential for development would be another question which can be put forward here. And probably, and in many countries, you have priority areas in the economic development sector, so you can take these up and ask yourself, well, can you kind of hook on to those economic priorities? So these are questions which cover the second issue, select economic sectors. Thirdly, identify frame conditions and challenges. One would be the financing issue, of course. What has to be done in order to support companies in financial terms, but also in kind. What about the poaching risk? Poaching is a very tricky issue in many countries, and it has to be addressed at a high level here. And what kind of potential contexts can be taken up, which are open-minded companies and people in these companies to address and to approach here. The implementation tool raises, at least in my view, raises all the important questions which have to be addressed somehow. And they not just raise the questions, but they also provide some options or provide some kind of substantial food for thought in order to answer these questions. Just to give an example, I can't go through all these different issues, but just to give an example, what you can expect here. For example, it provides the question, what are the relevant arguments to convince key actors in the business sector? So what kind of questions might come up raised by the counterparts in the companies, and how can you address these questions? And one issue or one area could be to raise some pros and also discuss some contra arguments. Companies might come up and say, well, is it really beneficial to me? Or does it just simply create costs for me? So you have to raise, or you have to discuss the cost-benefit argument. How does it contribute to the productivity in my work processes, and so on and so on. So you have a lot of arguments going on there, and the implementation tool at least addresses these issues and helps you as someone who is going to prepare talks to the company to discuss that. So what can you expect from the study, from the tool? I'm well aware that you all are experts in the field, and it's not reinventing the wheel, and it's not talking about a revolution. It means that all those things you already know and all the experiences you already gained are just enriched by something on top of it. It's something in addition, and it's kind in your toolbox. It's something which adds on things you already have. You might know this saying, if every problem is a nail, you only need a hammer. But in development cooperation, you don't have just nails, you have some more problems. You have some other things where you don't just need a hammer, you need probably some other instruments. And the ambition here would be to add your toolbox and to enrich your broad options of taking actions. And finally, just some kind of encouragement to use this study. And at best, this study provides you with new perspectives, and it provides some different views on things you probably have approached from different angles so far, and hopefully it could add new perspectives and new ways to take action. Thanks for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.